The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the second day of this 7-day sesshin here in September 2022, the first of another double header, as October sesshin will begin a week after the end of this one. An excellent way to do deep practice. It's not always possible for some people to do it because of work obligations, but when we can take the time to be in residence here at Mountain Gate, it can happen. Yesterday, I spoke about a common misconception about Zen practice, that if you walk into a Zendo, sit on that magic cushion, within a very short time, you'll be filled with bliss and everything will be hunky-dory after that. However, unfortunately, it doesn't happen that way. What happens instead, if we persist, and persistence is really, really important, that we will begin to open to where we are caught in not being able to be happy and not being able to be free of the kind of suffering that is endemic, particularly these days. And it takes time. It takes a long time. And we also recognize, hopefully, that it also takes courage, because in most cases, we grow up not wanting to feel bad, not wanting to feel insulted, not wanting to feel embarrassed, not wanting to feel pain and suffering of all kinds. And that's not what life is about. Particularly, for example, in high school, it's well known that that's a really challenging time for teenagers, and coming at a time when the teenage brain still is in a preliminary period of growth, that people do not have their full brain capacity online, particularly not the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for thinking rationally and understanding consequences, until the mid-20s. This is why perhaps we can have so many of these late teenagers doing crazy things like shooting people in grade schools and so on. But if we, back to Zen practice, if we persist in the face of whatever comes up and allow ourselves to feel it, it will make all the difference in the world. It's important, and it becomes ever more obviously important as time goes by, how some of the traditional way of teaching Zen practice has put blinders on us, emphasized the search for the answer to the breakthrough koan, and at the expense of dealing with very important things that might come up, particularly if we've been traumatized to some level, and trauma takes many, many forms. You don't have to be raped or beaten to be traumatized as you're growing up or in your later life. And it has been expected in past ways of teaching that if such memories or such feelings emerge in the practice, that they're to be ignored, shut down, denied, in the interest of that holy grail of supposed enlightenment. But enlightenment isn't narrow. Enlightenment is broad. It should impact every aspect of our life in positive ways. Furthermore, there are different levels of enlightenment. often beginning with superficial level. Very, very few people have the depth of enlightenment experience that, for example, Flora Courtois, an American woman who was at University of Michigan in the 1930s, early 1930s, late 1920s, early 1930s, and had a very, very deep awakening experience that was still viable, functioning, which is a very, very important aspect of an awakening experience, that it moves into the functioning of what we realize into our daily life. That Flora, 20 years later, when she encountered Mitra-roshi and told him her story, and he could see her demeanor and know her actions, get a sense of her as an extensively experienced Zen master, he felt it wasn't necessary to test her. There are testing questions when it comes to koans, and it's relatively easy for an experienced teacher to discern the depth of someone's awakening experience if they have one. I have to qualify that. Any experienced Zen teacher who has experienced awakening themselves, and in Rinzai, this is required in order to become a teacher. It was abandoned as a requirement in the 1900s by the Soto sect. That doesn't mean that the Soto sect is bad or wrong. It only means that, at least in certain quarters, it's hampered in how deeply it can guide students. The other person is Jacques Lissaron, the blind Frenchman who had a very deep awakening experience in Buchenwald. And when he was teaching decades later in the United States, it was still evident. The quality of it was still evident. The functioning of it was still evident. And those aren't the only people. But let me get into another point that many new Zen folk miss with regard to Zen practice. Often people come to Zen practice, for example, after reading Alan Watts. Alan Watts was a very prominent, I guess he was a Buddhist scholar. I hesitate to call him a Buddhist. And in fact, he committed suicide. However, he used to have gatherings in his house, and Flora Courtois was part of them at a certain point in time, when she realized that what they were talking about was what she had actually experienced, an awakening experience. But talking about it is not going to get us there. Reading about it is not going to get us there. Reading in general can hamper the progress of a person's practice. Roshi Kapleau used to say, and very cogently, if you're going to read a book that will inspire you to get on the cushion and do practice. In my early years in Zen practice, there were extremely few books on Zen, a small handful, not even enough to fill both hands, actually. And the Three Pillars of Zen was one of them. And if you've read the Three Pillars of Zen, you know that one section of the book is titled The Enlightenment Stories. And it is the stories of Kensho experiences by various different people, both Roshi Kapleau, although he's not overtly identified in it. He's the American businessman, if you want to figure out which one is his, and his wife also. And in fact, his wife's experience is used as the model for the fact that multiple Kensho experiences are available to us, and we should go there. You've heard many times in these teishos that the great transformative Zen master Hakuin Ekaku in Japan in the 1700s had 19 major Kensho experiences and countless minor insights. That is our model. And moreover, not just the Kensho, but the functioning of that Kensho in our life. In other words, it is possible to have deep insight into reality. And with it comes up normally very clear vision, at least at certain levels, of our own behavior and our own attitudes and our own ways of living, our own interactions with other people. And we have a choice then. We can go right into the felt sense of those experiences and become free of them and the habit patterns that drive them, or we can deny them because they don't fit with our social view of who we think we ought to be like. I remember many, many, many years ago, back in the late 1970s, we had just bought a car and used every bit of money to buy that little car, the cheapest car we could find. And we were going to drive it out to Santa Fe for the staff break that Zen students who live and practice at the Rochester Zen Center get a couple times a year. And on the day before we were to go, I was driving to a particular part of Rochester. It was February, by the way, and Rochester has terrible, terrible weather in the winter. And I started to turn left at a traffic light with nobody coming on, and suddenly this very large car came flying over a hill and did not attempt to stop and hit the back side of the car, spun me around and sent me flying backwards into a car that was perpendicular to the intersection. And I thought that a good Zen student would just sit there and be absolutely, totally calm about things. Well, that wasn't quite the story. I shook, I was jumpy. It took several days before my body settled down because I kept refusing to allow it to process physically the trauma of having been struck. Because the car was so new, it was not totaled. So we ended up being able to save the car. But nonetheless, I had all kinds of ideas about how a Zen person should be acting, and didn't think that I was acting in that appropriate way. Actually, I was fighting the natural way my body wanted to process that trauma out. And that was a mistake. It's not so different from denying what we see, what we open to as we're doing deepening practice. Things we don't like to see about ourselves, things we don't like to feel about ourselves. And yet these things have to be open to if we are to become truly free. I'd mentioned reading. It is interesting that many Zen groups throughout the United States have a group of people in a program that reads books and discusses books. To a certain degree, that's fine. But what I witnessed when I was part of that, leading it actually, the Rochester Zen Center, many years later than that early experience, what I saw was the people that came to the book clubs, so to speak, were not the people that were in the Zendo. And now, if that ultimately inspired people to go into the Zendo and start practicing, then that could be termed a valuable experience. But so often people use reading as a way to feel good about supposedly doing Zen practice by reading without actually doing Zen practice. And while it may feel rewarding, and that's fine, if you're determined to do Zen practice, that's not the path. Reading can psychologically sometimes inspire and give insight, but it cannot bring about the depth of insight and the depth of functioning that is really essential if we are to become free. Only Zazen, extended Zazen, committed Zazen, ongoing Zazen can do that. So again, in my early years of Zen practice, thankfully I had recognized in an experience before I ever got to Zen practice that the misery that I was going through was never going to be freed up. I was never going to become freed from it without going inside. I could engage in the kinds of things that people do. A lot of them I was not interested in, like drinking and drugging and sexual activity. But I had other ways to try to escape, and periodically I would be able to escape into some level of pleasure by buying something briefly. But it never lasted. Nothing ever lasted. And so I finally realized very, very deeply that the only way to lasting peace and happiness was to go within. The same realization that the Buddha had. He tried 6 years of ascetic practice, wreaking havoc with his body, starving himself and so on, in an attempt to find the answers to his questions about why this suffering, why we're born and then we get sick and we get old and we die, and that's all that life is about? Some pleasure here and there, but ultimately these seemingly devastating occurrences of sickness, old age, and death. And finally he realized that the only way he was going to find the answers was to go within. And that is true ever since, and probably before, I'm sure before, the Buddha recognized it. And it was only because I had recognized it so strongly that I was willing to stick out Zen practice, because for me, Zen practice was exceedingly challenged. I had a history that made it so, and it was a struggle for a while. In order to sort of inspire myself and give myself some level of hope, I would read the enlightenment stories in the 3 Pillars of Zen, until one day, after a number of sessions in which I was practicing with one eye, attempting to practice, attempting to somehow fathom the Mukon, and the other eye on an analysis of where my mind state was at a given time in comparison to the stories in the Enlightenment stories in the book, I realized that that was dividing my efforts and getting me nowhere, so I quit reading. Roshi Kapleau didn't want any of his students reading, really, until after they had gone very, very far in Zen. And as a matter of fact, in the Rinzai sect, one doesn't normally read until after one has gone through many, many subsequent koans And then one reads the sutras, because having gone through enough koans to be open deeply enough to understand the sutras, they can be immensely inspiring and deepening. But no one comes to awakening at the level that is potential for each human being simply through reading. And if we're serious about practice, it can be a drag on that practice. If it inspires, fine. But be very, very careful that you're not using it as an escape. So that's all I have to say this day. It's two important things: the commitment to practice, to 360-degree practice, full practice, and the commitment to not deceiving ourselves or diluting our efforts through a lot of reading. An exception to this, and it's just barely an exception, is that if you've been working on what's known as a breakthrough koan and you have gone deep enough in terms of understanding the depths of that koan, in other words, you've had some level of kensho deep enough that you can successfully work on subsequent koans. And again, I have to say that there are different levels of insight, different levels of awakening experiences, different levels of kensho, of satori. And that's another mistaken idea from the past, that one satori and boom, you're home free. It's not the case. It is only a bit of light in an otherwise dark path that helps you understand how to move forward now within that path and to go deeper. But if you're working on subsequent koans, it's essential to memorize each of the koans before you work on it and offer a demonstration, not a story, not an explanation, but a demonstration to your teacher. Then, of course, you have to read that. But to read expansively as an assumption that that's how you can awaken, you're, like I say, you're putting a drag on your practice. Read what inspires you to practice and let it go at that. What we want to do is allow as little resistance, as little distraction in our minds, so that we can go deep. And every additional movie we go to, all the television shows we watch, all the reading we do, puts a lot of extra stuff in our heads that is like a lot of bats flying around when we're trying to give ourselves to the extended out breath. Bits and pieces of that last movie pop up. Bits and pieces of that last novel we read pop up. And it's harder. This is why people have gathered in monasteries for so long, because there's a dedication to practice without the distractions. That doesn't mean you should dedicate your life to living in a monastery, unless, of course, that's your karma. But it is an environment that is specifically set up with as little distraction as possible so that the practice can go deeply. So now you've got a menu for, or I should say a path, a description of the path to come to awakening, at least in terms of what not to do. And the rest of it is seeking wordlessly, deeply, with great curiosity, because it is well known and well experienced that we can become free. We can comprehend who we really are and truly become free if we do this practice deeply enough. So that's it. In one way, it is a magic cushion. Another way, the magic is in our own mind. The cushion is there as a way to help it happen. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.